so stressful. Hi and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rasha Shaaban. I'm working at the National Museums of World Culture, and I'm sitting here today with Niels Righolt he's the CEO of the Danish Center for Arts and Intercultural in Copenhagen. And I also have Helen O'Donoghue. Hi, Helen. She is joining us from the Irish Museum of Modern Art in Dublin. Today, our topic for this webinar is creativity and culture for social inclusion. It's a topic that is very close to many of us coming from this background in the arts and culture sector. And the reason behind the selection of this topic is that it has been one of the main thematic focuses of EPALE for this year, for 2022. So our time is short and there is a lot to discuss. Thank you everyone for joining us with the comments and the questions. We hope you will enjoy our discussion here today, and we look forward to your questions and comments. It's without doubt that culture and creativity and arts are key tools in our society today. We are looking at some threats towards democracy in society, and we are looking at budget cut downs in culture. Whenever there is an economic crisis, there's always, okay, let's go and save money from where it's the budget of the arts and culture. And then later on, we see the curves of segregation, the curves of crime and gangs and criminality going up high, which at the same time is translated into voting more right and more extreme right in Europe. Art and culture, they are very important because they contribute to the formation of attitudes and behaviors, and they sustain our self-identity and our sense of belonging. One of the comments that we received was about post-pandemic societies from Mary, and how arts and culture are very important. They start at the school, at the library, at the museum, at home. This is how we work to get ourselves out of the bubble. This is just a brief introduction, and I would like to ask Niels to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about what he does.
Thank you very much, Rasha. Hello, everybody. My name is Niels Righolt, and I'm as Rasha said, the CEO of the Danish Center for Arts and Interculture, which is a capacity and competence center that works in the intersection between helping institutions to anchor their purpose in terms of the communities they serve. Coming from Scandinavia, the logic here is that some 80% of the total turnover in the cultural sector is publicly funded, some one way or the other. So there is a large public expectation, in a way you could say, that cultural institutions also interact as democratic institutions and take a democratic responsibility of serving more people than the usual suspects, the few and the well-educated. So in one hand, we are working very much on audiences, the relationship between the institutions and their audiences, or people, as we would rather say. We work with research, and then we work with policy making. So that intersection is very much about how culture fits into society, what kind of role and purpose culture fits into society. And we have a lot of cousins across Europe, and we are in Denmark quite interested in following the Centre for Cultural Value, for instance, that has been established in the UK, which is also kind of monitoring and tapping into what are the actual effects when cultural institutions take a democratic or a societal responsibility, and how does that reflect into the practice of the arts and cultural institutions. So very short.
Thank you very much, Niels. How about you, Helen? Can you tell our audience who you are and what you're doing?
Yeah. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Rasha, for the introduction. And I'm delighted to be here for EPALE. I have just recently left the museum that I was working in, the Irish Museum of Modern Art, after 31 years. And I suppose what I'm in a period now of reflection. I trained as an artist, a fine artist, and worked for about 10 years before I joined the museum. And through my work, I discovered the transformative power of the arts, both in education settings and in community settings. So I brought this passion with me to a new museum when it opened in 1991. And we had a very, very dynamic director in the early 90s. And we indeed at IMA have a very dynamic director now in 2022. The museum has always positioned itself as a place within society. It opened with a policy of access and inclusion. And my role, I suppose, as head of engagement and learning was to make that policy a reality for people. So we worked very closely with partners, both cultural partners and social partners and education partners, initially in the immediate environs of the museum, and then gradually, I suppose, like putting a pebble in a pond, those ripples rippled out to include national partnerships, European partnerships, and beyond that. So I believe in the museum as a space that belongs to everybody, but I'm not naive about what it takes to make that happen. So I hope that our discussion today will unpack some of the projects and processes that we've been involved in ourselves, the three of us, but also that the participants on this webinar will also contribute to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. I'm just going to dive directly to our first topic or question here, talking about democratic values and to no one's denial, democracy is under threat today in Europe. And I just want to ask, get the three of us to share from our work about what we do, give examples of how can we bring the family of Europe again together, members of the family together. Helen, would you like to go ahead? Thank you. Yes.
Yes. Well, you know, the museum, the Irish Museum of Modern Art is, as I said, it's a national cultural institution, so it has a responsibility to play its role nationally. And in recent years, Ireland, like all of Europe, is receiving new migrants into our country. And building on the experiences that we've had over the last 30 years of working with diverse communities, we're building on those methodologies to introduce and continue to provide services for people who are currently coming to live in Ireland. I think one of the key partnerships, and I mentioned partnership in my introduction, that has worked really successfully for us, and this is one very specific project, is we've partnered with the Universities of Sanctuary Movement and with Dublin City University in particular, who have a very developed sanctuary program. That is a program that offers not just refuge for asylum seekers and refugees, but further education and pathways towards professional development. And we've included a program based physically in the Irish Museum of Modern Art, which is based on one of their first stepped programs, which is about hospitality and welcoming. And we have structured a program that has engaged people from diverse countries in looking at and working with Irish citizens and others, and looking at commonalities. So the first project that we looked at was based on hospitality, and it was called Visual Voices. And that the outcomes of that programme was exhibited at the Irish Museum of Modern Art. And that then in turn opened out the museum and the discourse to a wider cohort of people. And we've been building on that, in particular at European level, through a project called SPICE. And we have a full-time researcher activator on that project. And he has been developing similar partnerships with a whole range of new and diverse communities across Ireland, and particularly those for whom access to the museum wouldn't be commonplace. So I have some references to that, those programs in that can be made available to participants.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen. Niels, do you want to?
But I think that's really interesting that you mentioned partnerships so clearly, Helen, because we engaged after the refugee streams that came into our part of Europe in 2015, 2014, 15, 16, actually. The aftermath of that, there was an increased need to reflect on what's the role of our cultural institutions, to embrace the narratives, but also to help through culture to give newcomers an opportunity to enter society beyond getting a CPR or personal ID number, but actually become citizens, become active citizens, and redefining their own role in society through a kind of cultural interaction with a cultural operator. So we designed a project together with 7 museums, the National Museum, which is a cultural heritage museum in Denmark, in Copenhagen, the Workers' Museum, which have a very, very clear focus point on working conditions, labor conditions, and labor conditions related to democratic interaction in society. And then 5 regional cultural heritage museums across the country in quite different settings, to see if we were able to design interaction cross points where refugees and the refugee interaction system, the politically launched refugee system, could actually find ease in collaborating with the cultural institution. And we quite early on realized that that's quite difficult, because they are run by kind of different logics, a different kind of legislation, which is very much politicized. So the solution became to work with other actors that are in immediate contact with the people that we were trying to help, or to become relevant to, which is probably a more precise definition of what we were doing. And so we created what we would describe as catalytic partnerships for change, for organizational and methodological change, with housing centers, with language schools, with interaction offices, with communities, with local kitchens, all kinds of organizations that had a kind of social interaction with the people that we were trying to reach. And the aim of that was to see if we could find people who would then help the institutions co-create a kind of new learning framework, a kind of learning framework that was tailor-made to their needs, not to the ambitions of the museum, but to the needs of the individuals. And through that period, it took us 3 years. The project was defined as an innovation project over a period of 3 years. But what was really, really interesting was that during that period, some of the institutions realized that language, the way they presented the exhibitions, the way they were welcoming their visitors, the way they interacted beforehand, was excluding other people, other groups of society. So they altered their practice as an effect of that project. And actually yesterday, the Workers' Museum in Copenhagen received the Culture for Europe Museum Prize for exactly that work, which is kind of interesting, because it shows that the work started off in 2017. 2022, it's being recognized. So time also became an issue, that we can't just make short-term working projects because they will never change anything. But we realized that the partnerships need to grow, they need to mature, and in order to do that, you need time. So it was a very interesting large-scale innovation project. But what was even more interesting was the long-term effects on the local level. So just one example, and then I'll stop, was the museum on Bornholm. Bornholm is an island in the midst of the Baltic Sea. And the museum decided that instead of trying to get people to the museum, they wanted to reflect life conditions in the circumstances where people were actually living. Quite a number of migrants were living in a social housing area near the biggest city on the island, Rønne. And so what they did was they engaged with museum professionals, photographers and artists to illustrate some of the concerns and some of the topics of life that these people were really, really engaged in. And then they placed them as pop-up intervention exhibitions around that area where people were living. So that could be in a laundry house, or it could be on the street, or it could be in a community center. But the museum interacted in the circumstances where people actually lived, and that immediately resonated and created the opportunity to relate long-term with these people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I can, Helen.
No, just two things that Niels picked up on there that resonate with me. One is time, to be committed in institutions to this type of developmental work. It's time to build up trust. A partnership can't just be a piece of paper. It's actually about relationships. And I think that takes time. And the second thing really is not underestimating the power of a cultural institution. We in Ireland, the museum I have been working in is publicly funded. So its agency also needs to be used very wisely in partnerships. So they're the 2 points that resonate with me, Niels, when you're talking there.
At the National Museums of World Culture, in the one I'm working at in Gothenburg, we actually building on this issue of the trust. We try to avoid like some kind of a one-time off partnerships. So we know that we have every year we are hosting the big celebration of Eid after Ramadan. There we try to reach out to the community constantly through different activities, and we also have a program called "Democracy Does Not Exist, We Make It." And sometimes watching a performance for 5 minutes can make a huge impact on your life, more than studying or reading about it at school for many, many, many years. So hence the power of arts and culture, and why we are trying to push European institutions to put more budget. You talk about the green policy, the green recovery. You won't be able to do the green recovery without a culture recovery. To raise people's awareness about the climate, to raise people's awareness about LGBT issues, about gender issues, about migrants issues. What you need is to invest first and foremost in arts and culture. A democratic reflection on transformation leadership at some point. What do you want to tell us about that, Niels?
I'm just tapping into what you just said, because I think, knowing that you come from Gothenburg, and over the last 6-7 months, I've had the privilege to work with 3 of the other institutions in Gothenburg, the Art Museum, the Art Center, and the Design Museum. And it has been a kind of design thinking process, which is about transformation of a logic, but it's very much about becoming relevant to a larger part of society. And in that process, you have to reflect on the kind of societal role you play in a democratic structure. So when you said democracy doesn't exist. Democracy is actually something that we create. You could even say that for cultural institutions, democracy is constantly on the agenda as kind of living material that you have to address and talk about and readdress and reflect on, because the minute you do that, you will realize that quite a number of the fingers that you point at yourself and about your own institutional readiness to follow changes in society and to be receptive and to be agile enough to really, alter the practice so you become relevant to more people.
Indeed, which is actually going to take us to the next topic of the discussion, which is about the role of cultural spaces and institutions. Like, what role do we play? What kind of duties do we have towards the society? I also work in a state-funded museum like you did, Helen. What is our role when it comes to tackling today's issues and today's threats against democracy? We started, for example, by having, right now we have on display an exhibition that is called Democracy Doesn't Exist, We Make It. We have stories from all over the world, from activists talking about human rights situations and threats to democracy in their countries and how they stood up to that. We're also working a lot with the storytelling. We're trying to be an open space for everyone who wants to come and get access to culture. I think the role that we have as well is through the program that we design for schools and students at schools, that they come and visit the museums, and we have our pedagogues who go through the different content of the exhibitions. I believe we try to complement everything else that is happening at school and the library, at home, to make the circle a little bit full. What do you think, Helen?
Yeah. Like you've described, the Irish Museum of Modern Art has a multifaceted programme. And I think the power of and the unique role that a museum or a cultural space has is that, the assets we have in the museum are the collection. We have spaces for artists to work. We have public spaces for people to meet. So we're a social space where people from very diverse backgrounds can come and engage with one another. But as museum professionals, we have to actually structure that in a way that makes the museum accessible, as I said in my first point. So, for example, one of the big assets is the fact that the museum has a huge collection. So with reference to the European funded programme that we're currently engaged in, which is titled Citizen Curation, it's premised on the belief that everybody's opinion matters, everybody's story matters, and that an artwork can unlock many different stories, many diverse meanings from those who are engaging with the artwork. And the Citizen Curation programme is premised on the idea that those stories can interact and interweave and interject with each other, and that through that people can share experiences, and we can build up a community who are open to learning about one another. But I think in the first place, one has to learn a little bit about oneself. What is the trigger? Why am I responding to this artwork in this way? So that has to be very carefully constructed by museum professionals, be they pedagogues or activists, so that we provide, as I mentioned earlier, a safe space for people to engage and to express themselves and feel that they'll be heard and listened to. And then the museum can structure that by, creating those opportunities for people to link beyond the immediacy of the museum. So I think, I'm a big big advocate for European Learning Partnership programs, because I think that creates pathways for people to engage and link. And certainly Ireland up to 10 years ago was quite a homogeneous culture. You know, we had a lot of outward emigration, but not so much inward migration. So being part of European funded learning programs assisted us to engage in a lot of diverse conversations, which are currently very pertinent on a day-to-day basis.
Niels, do you want to add something?
Yeah, absolutely. We made some, I mean, the position, the role of arts and cultural institutions in our part of the world, Russia, is very much defined by the, in Sweden you say uppdragsgivarna, so the policymakers, the political framework providing the money. And there is this sometimes it's outspoken, sometimes it's in between the lines, but there is a very clear democratic expectation on the one side. On the other side, the formal structures reproduce an understanding of arts and cultural institutions that is not necessarily aligned with where we are 2022. I think that's one of the big conflicts, is that the whole design of our infrastructure belongs to the 19th and 20th century, to the modernistic perception of what's the role of art in society and what's the role of art for the individual. Whereas today we see that things they kind of derive from different positions outside of the arts and cultural institutions, but they don't have less value because of that. So there's something about the transition between democratization of culture, democratization of a logic which is owned, so to speak, by the institutions, and a kind of representation of cultural democracy, where things is actually being given a value bottom up, from a bottom up perspective. In Trinity College in Dublin, Stephen Hatley just arrived as a researcher. And he wrote a fantastic book last year about audiences and cultural policy, where he kind of reflects about the position of cultural institutions in society, the kind of role that they play. And one of his key points, which is quite interesting, is that institutions have become enormously porous, and they've become porous over a very long period of time. And I mean, the emergence of the ever-present gadget, this one, the smartphone, has completely changed the way that people prepare, that people design their visit. It's kind of changed the way that they prepare in terms of getting knowledge about what they're about to experience. But also it kind of gives us an opportunity, if we interact with people, to redefine the purpose that we have in the interaction with the audience that we want to become relevant to. So there's something about communities. There's something about resilience in terms of the community, not just the institution, but resilience in terms of the community, meaning that arts and cultural institutions can help communities to grow their own logics. There's this amazing project in the UK that has been started by Arts Council England, which is about creative people and places, giving opportunities to people outside of the cultural framework, so to speak, to act culturally, but to help being facilitated by professionals, so that they interact and they get an understanding that their narratives also have a value. Because this is one of the key issues that was presented by a Danish researcher, Musa Gama, is about, for instance, if we co-curate, if we invite people into a co-curatorial process, do we then give them the same mandate when they're sitting around the table? Do we then offer them an opportunity to really influence the end product, to really influence the learning circumstance, to influence, the activity that they're about to invest time into? And for many institutions, the answer has been, oh, we would like that to happen, but no. Whereas the institutions that are often kind of presented as institutions that we all can seek, inspiration in, are institutions where they said, well, this is risky business, but the answer is yes.
Yeah.
because it's only through the yes to giving power to somebody else, distributing opportunities to somebody else, that we can alter the practice that we have, and that we can bring ourselves on a level, align ourselves with the needs and the opportunities of 2022. So there's a huge transition taking place, and I see more and more institutions tap into it. Big size institutions like the National Gallery in Copenhagen, for instance, and small scale institutions. And we can also see that there is a logic that small scale institutions, they are very often the front runners. They are the ones doing the first, investigative work. And then the bigger institutions like the Museum of World Culture, for instance, follow. And when you follow and show that it's actually possible for a state-funded organization to do it, then the rest can actually do it too. So there's also kind of an evolutionary logic baked into this. But it's happening more and more, and I think it's enormously interesting.
Another institution as well that plays a very important role is libraries. And that's a comment that was raised by Agnes in the chat, and how libraries are a great place where we don't just meet to read books, but it's a cultural institution, and people get to know each other from different parts of the society. Thank you, Agnes, for that. And another comment also was about creative thinking and the role of arts and culture in sharpening our skill of creative thinking, especially in adult education, by Margareta. And one more comment that I really liked was from Ingrida. She talks about how cultural institutions, they appeal to us through emotions, whereas at school, at university, it's the logic, this is 1 + 1 = 2, but this is the role and the most important added value is how they appeal to us through emotions. Indeed, Ilse, your point about creative thinking, how priceless it is, and it's so important for sharpening our imagination and imagining a different world. And this is what you experience when you, for example, go and attend an exhibition, or you attend a dance show, or you attend a theater show. You imagine another reality. It makes you feel, okay, another reality is possible than what we have today. I know that we've got 3 minutes left, and we have a really important question to tackle upon, the transformative power of arts and culture, particularly using storytelling. I'll take 1 minute just to talk about Mind the Gap program. In Gothenburg, known to be one of the most segregated cities of Europe. And when I arrived to Sweden as a migrant in 2016, and I started to talk to other migrants and refugees, and the first thing was like, where are the Swedes? We don't meet the Swedes. And then I started to read a lot about the power of storytelling and how it creates human bridges. Niels, Helen, we never met before in person, and probably this is the first or second time that we meet online. But I'm sure if we start to share stories about, I don't know, tell a time where you felt challenged or you were sad for the loss of, you will see how we have so much in common despite our completely different backgrounds, both socio-cultural backgrounds. So with the power of storytelling, we worked on reducing the gap that we have in Gothenburg by bringing people from different parts of the city. We always use the term local community because you are a local now. You have the refugee status, but you are a local. So Mind the Gap, and there was an article on EPALE about the power of storytelling. You can check it out later, everyone. How about you, Helen? Do you want to tell us something?
Okay, yes. Well, I have two things. I want to say that I spent Monday watching your Mind the Gap videos, and I found them to be extraordinarily powerful. You talk about that, I think when you're talking about emotions, the embodied experience, even as I'm talking to you, all of the, perimeters of my body, all the hairs are standing up on my body because they're so universal. Each of those stories are, whilst it belongs to the person who's telling it, me as a listener could relate to it. And they're incredibly humble. There's humility, there's empathy, and there's power in those stories. And, you know, it drew me then to somebody whom is an enormously important leader in Ireland, who at one of the seminal projects that I was involved in that really proved to me the power of museums, the power of culture, the power of storytelling. At the time, our current president, Michael D. Higgins, had just been appointed Minister for Culture. And if I could quote from him about the power of storytelling, and then I'll leave it at that. So in 1993, he said this. He said, "I think this question of having one's stories told, the right to tell one's story, is the single greatest cultural question in the world. All repressive regimes, all people who are intolerant, hang together by this attitude of trying to have an official version of things and suppressing the right for other stories and other lives to surface. And it is one of the marks of humanity and the only way to peace and coexistence in this fragile planet, ecologically and in human terms, if we can develop the capacity to be able to allow other cultures to find their space, and within cultures, people's experience and stories." And I want to say, yes, Rasha, Mind the Gap worked for, like, it spoke to those words of Michael D. Higgins.
Thank you, Helen. Do you have something to say, Niels?
Yeah, I would have loved lots of things to say, but with only a minute left, I think I will basically leave it at Helen's quote, which was a beautiful kind of sum up of the opportunities and the needs that we have. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Niels. Thank you, Helen. Also, one of the comments we got is about community-based sociocultural local centers and their power to reach everyone, in particular youth, and integrate the ideas that youth have and different minority groups, to try to break this bubble and bring as many people together as possible. As we're approaching the end of today's webinar, I would like to say that this is the last webinar of EPALE for this year. There will be a continuation of this discussion in the written form on the chat, on the website, on the page of this webinar. I would like to thank very much the team that put together this discussion. I would like to personally thank Sara Salary, and I would like to thank Claudia Dermaro. And again, thank you so much, Niels and Helen, for such a refreshed start of the day. It's very dark outside. You know, we're slowly reaching the shortest day of the year, and that was just bright light on such a dark morning. Thank you, Niels. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, and
yes, thank you very much.
For everyone, democracy is a verb. It's a living object that we need to feed. It doesn't exist. We make it. Thank you, and see you later at the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you.